In this video, we're going to be looking at the function of the skeleton, and just bear in mind that you need to understand and apply examples in physical activity of the functions of the skeleton. So it's not just enough to know what the functions are, it's about applying them to sporting examples in your PE or physical activity in your sport. So in no particular order, let's have a look at some of those functions. There's 6 you need to know in total. And the first one is protection. Now hopefully this is relatively straightforward for you. You'll remember that it's the ribs that protect the heart and the lungs, and it's the cranium that protects the brain. So that's the function. What you then need to be able to do is give an example in sport of what that protection does. So we might say that the ribs protect the heart and lungs from the impact of a tackle in rugby. Or we might say the cranium protects the brain when you head a football in football. Okay, so it's as simple as that, but make sure you follow through with your practical example. The next one, obviously a big one, is movement. So we need to understand how movement takes place. So if we just have a look here, you remember that muscles are attached to bones and they form a lever system. That's a really, really important point to make. So the muscles attach to bones to form a lever system, and remember that the muscles contract and pull the bones. And so it's the contraction of the muscles that pull the bones. Example here, hamstrings attach there to the upper and lower leg to create flexion at the knee. So we flex the knee when we're kicking the ball. The next one is blood cell production. Now this is quite an interesting one because it's important that I think there are 3 things really you need to know about this. First of all, where does that take place? Well, it takes place in the long bones. Remember we looked in the previous video at the long bones such as the humerus and the femur. So it takes place in the long bones, and the reason is because those long bones contain marrow. And so the production of the blood cells takes place in the marrow bones, and there are 3 different types of blood cells that are produced, and they are red blood cells, you can see, white blood cells and platelets. Now obviously we'll be coming on to looking at the cardiovascular system and the blood and the role of these blood cells in due course. Just remember that they're produced in the large bones, the long bones, in the marrow, and it's platelets, red blood cells and white blood cells that are produced. And in terms of your practical example of blood cell production, we can talk about the importance of red blood cells for physical activity, because of course red blood cells are the blood cells which carry oxygen to the working muscles, and therefore we need to have a sufficient supply of red blood cells to make sure that we can carry out our movement. So you can talk about any movement, running, kicking, jumping, catching, throwing, whatever it happens to be in a particular sport. Obviously we need oxygen to provide the energy, particularly for endurance type activities, so long distance running or activities that last for a period of time. Let's go over the page and carry on. So the next one is mineral storage, and just useful for you to know at this point that the 2 main minerals really are calcium and phosphorus that we need to be talking about as examples. You might want to talk about iron as well, but essentially bones store minerals such as calcium, phosphorus and iron. Now the next 2 are similar, but there is a slight distinction between the 2. So the next one is structural shape, and that means that it's the skeleton that gives us our shape by helping us to stand up straight, gives us our shape, so our head is round because the cranium is round, our shoulders are broad because that's the way the skeleton is structured in terms of the scapula and the clavicle, the collarbone, etc. So the skeleton gives us our shape and keeps us standing upright. And in terms of practical example for structural shape, we can talk about the skeleton. That's defining what we look like. So of course some people are tall, some people are shorter, some people are broader around the chest, and that enables people to play particularly different types of sports. So obviously a basketball player who's very tall would have an advantage. If someone is a prop forward, for example, in rugby, they may be a little bit smaller. And so the structural shape, depending upon what you look like, what your physical build is, will have an impact and influence on the type of sport that you can take part in. And then the next one is support. That's our last one. So very similar. This one differs in that we can talk about the skeleton acting as a framework for the muscles to attach. Remember we talked about muscles attaching in the previous point. So the skeleton acts as a framework for muscles and tissues to attach, and it helps with good posture.